What if one of the biggest arguments in climate science was never really about carbon first, but about the sun, not as a side detail, not as a minor influence, but as the main driver? That is the case Willie Soon has spent years trying to make. And that case did not just challenge a few charts. It collided with one of the strongest scientific consensuses in the modern world. So here is the real question. Is Willie Soon exposing a hole in climate science? Or is he a man pushing a theory that most researchers believe does not survive the evidence? Tonight, we stay with that question. And we stay with one man. Because this story is not about every climate skeptic. It is not about every energy company. It is not about the entire history of climate politics. This is about Willie Soon, his research, his argument, and the scientific reaction to his work. And before you decide what to think, ask yourself this. If the sun is the engine of life on Earth, why wouldn't it also be the engine of climate change? That question sounds simple, but it opens a door into one of the most intense scientific fights of our time. Willie Soon is an astrophysicist and geoscientist who became widely known for arguing that solar variability has been underestimated in climate science. He has repeatedly pushed the idea that changes in the sun, not just greenhouse gases, deserve far more weight in explaining climate patterns. Source. And that matters because if he is right, even partly right, then a huge part of the climate debate changes shape. Not necessarily all of it, but enough to shake confidence. Enough to make people stop. Enough to force a second look. Soon's basic argument is psychologically powerful because it feels intuitive. The sun is massive. Human beings are tiny. The climate is complicated. So maybe the biggest object in the system is still the one calling the shots. That instinct has pulled millions of people toward his work. But science does not reward instinct. It rewards evidence. And this is where Willie Soon became impossible to ignore. One of his most cited papers came in 2005 when he published a study on Arctic surface air temperatures over roughly 130 years. In that paper, he argued that variations in total solar radiance were a more plausible explanation for multi-decadal Arctic temperature changes than rising atmospheric carbon dioxide. The paper's summary claimed solar forcing explained more than 75% of the variance in decadally smooth Arctic annual mean or spring temperatures. Source. Pause there. More than 75%. That is not a small correction to the mainstream view. That is not a footnote. That is a direct challenge. Because if solar forcing explains that much of the pattern in the Arctic, then the standard narrative starts to look less secure than many people assume. And that is exactly why Soon's argument hit such a nerve. He was not just saying, the climate is complicated. He was saying something sharper, something more dangerous to the consensus. He was saying the dominant explanation may be missing the dominant force. Now imagine hearing that as a viewer who already feels uneasy about official narratives. Imagine hearing that as someone who sees institutions as overconfident. Imagine hearing that from a scientist with technical credentials, published work, and the ability to speak in the language of data. Wouldn't that grab you? Wouldn't you at least want to know more? But the scientific reaction was fast, and it was harsh, because the climate science community does not evaluate a claim by how dramatic it sounds. It evaluates the claim by whether it survives broader evidence across multiple lines of analysis. And on that front, the mainstream response to the solar argument has been remarkably consistent. Major scientific assessments have treated solar variability as real, measurable, and important to understand, but they have not concluded that it explains most recent warming. The National Academy stated there is no substantive scientific evidence that solar variability is the cause of climate change in the past 50 years, while also noting that the mechanisms linking solar changes and climate still require investigation. Source. That nuance matters. Notice what they are not saying. They are not saying the sun does nothing. They are not saying solar effects are fake. They are not saying all questions are closed forever. They are saying something more precise. Yes, solar variability exists. Yes, it can influence climate. But no, the evidence does not support it as the main explanation for recent climate change over the last half-century. That distinction became the central battlefield of Soon's public identity, because his supporters often hear one thing: the sun has been ignored, while his critics hear something else: He is overselling solar influence far beyond what the data can justify. And in climate science, that difference is everything. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has long framed detection and attribution as a process of separating different signals, including greenhouse gases, solar irradiance changes, volcanic aerosols, and other forcings, to see which combinations best match observed warming. In that framework, solar forcing is not ignored. It is included as a distinct signal. But the detection of greenhouse gas influence is treated as strong attribution evidence when observations cannot be explained without it. Source: this is where the story becomes intellectually difficult, because Willie Soon's case is not built on saying the sun exists. Everyone agrees on that. His case is built on saying the sun's role has been undervalued so badly that attribution itself may be distorted. That is a much bigger claim, and a much harder one to prove. Soon continued making that broader case in later years. Scholarly search results show later papers co-authored by Soon and colleagues, including how much has the sun influenced northern hemisphere temperature trends, an ongoing debate and challenges in the detection and attribution of northern hemisphere surface temperature trends since 1850. Both arguing the attribution debate is still open. Source. And that phrase matters. Ongoing debate. Because to Willie Soon, the debate is not over. The verdict is not final. The confidence is too high. The sun still has not had its full day in court. That is the emotional core of his scientific identity. He is not presenting himself as a man adjusting a settled equation. He is presenting himself as someone reopening the trial. And that is compelling, very compelling, especially in an age when audiences are drawn to dissenters, outsiders, and people who challenge institutional certainty. But then came another layer of conflict, a layer that changed how many people viewed not just his argument, but him. In 2015, reporting described a funding and disclosure controversy around Willie Soon, including claims that he had received money from fossil fuel interests and had failed to disclose conflict of interest in some of his scientific work. The Guardian reported that documents show financial support from industry-related sources, and that the issue mattered because undisclosed backing raised questions about impartiality and transparency. Source: and with that, the scientific debate became something darker in the public mind. Not just data, not just models, not just solar cycles. Trust in motive, trust in transparency, trust in whether the messenger can be separated from the message. This is where people often choose sides too quickly. Some saw the controversy and concluded the science itself must be worthless. Others saw the controversy and became even more convinced that Soon was being targeted because he threatened powerful narratives. But neither reaction solves the real problem. Because funding questions can affect trust. Yes. They can affect credibility. Yes. They can absolutely change how people evaluate a scientist's conduct, but they do not automatically settle every technical argument. And that creates an uncomfortable tension. A person can raise a valid question and still become controversial. A scientist can be criticized on ethics and still force useful scrutiny on methods. A provocative argument can attract support for the wrong reasons and criticism for the right ones, or the reverse. So what do we do with Willie Soon? Do we dismiss him because the mainstream rejects his conclusions? Do we embrace him because he challenges the mainstream? Or do we do the harder thing and separate the emotional appeal of dissent from the actual strength of the evidence? That is the challenge his story leaves with every viewer. Because Soon's argument succeeds at the level of narrative long before it succeeds at the level of proof. It has scale. It has drama. It has cosmic force. It has a villain, if you want one. It has an underdog, if you want one. It has institutions, controversy, danger, and forbidden questions. And people are vulnerable to that structure. All of us are. So let's slow down. What is the strongest version of Willie Soon's case? It is not that carbon dioxide does nothing. It is not that every climate model is fraud. The strongest version of his case is that the climate system is too complex for confident attribution if solar variability, long-term natural cycles, and data uncertainty are still not fully resolved. That is the Steelman version, and it deserves to be understood clearly. What is the strongest mainstream reply? That those uncertainties have already been studied extensively, that solar forcing is included, not ignored, and that the broader evidence still points overwhelmingly toward greenhouse gases as the dominant driver of recent warming, especially over the modern period. Source. And that is why this debate feels so intense, because both sides use a language of reason, but underneath that language sits something more human: fear of getting the biggest question wrong. If Soon is substantially right, then science may have overcommit too early. If he is substantially wrong, then public fascination with his case may distract from a genuine and urgent problem. That is not a trivial disagreement. That is civilizational pressure. And maybe that is why Willie Soon keeps returning in the conversation. Not because he represents the majority view. He does not. But because he represents a recurring pressure point in modern science. How certain is too certain? How much uncertainty is enough to justify dissent? And when does skepticism sharpen science? And when does it only confuse the public? Those questions make his story bigger than a single paper. But only if we stay honest. Honest about what he argued. Honest about what the mainstream says back. Honest about where evidence appears stronger. And honest about the emotional pull of scientists who says the biggest object in our sky may still be the least appreciated actor in the room. Now ask yourself this. When you hear the sun may be driving climate change, does that sound persuasive because of the data, or because it feels grand, natural, and intuitively true? Second question. If institutions say they have already accounted for solar influence, do you trust that conclusion because you have seen the evidence, or because you trust the institution that says it? And one more. If a controversial scientist keeps pressing on the same pressure point year after year, does that make him stubborn or necessary? Those are not easy questions. And that is why this story continues to live. Because Willie Soon is not just offering an alternative climate argument. He is forcing audiences to confront how they decide what counts as authority. The outsider with a cosmic explanation, or the majority view built on cumulative assessment. In the end, the scientific establishment has not followed Soon where he wanted to go. The dominant assessments still do not accept solar variability as the primary explanation for recent warming, even while acknowledging it as a real part of the climate system. Source. That is the current balance of the evidence as major institutions present it. But Willie Soon's case still matters, because science is not only tested by agreement, it is also tested by challenge. And sometimes the most revealing thing about a scientific field is not just what it concludes, but how it reacts when someone refuses to accept the conclusion. Willie Soon did that, again and again. He argued that the sun deserved more explanatory power. He argued that attribution remained more open than the mainstream claimed. And in response, the scientific world pushed back hard, saying the broader evidence still does not support his core conclusion. Source. So where does that leave us? Not with a simple hero, not with a simple villain, and not with an easy ending. It leaves us with scientists who kept pressing one explosive idea. What if the sky above us is still more powerful than the politics below us? That question built his reputation. It built the controversy around him, and it is the reason his name still pulls attention. But attention is not proof, and controversy is not validation. Only evidence can carry that weight. If you think Willie Soon has been unfairly dismissed, say why. If you think his solar case fails against the broader evidence, say why. But do not look away from the actual argument, because the real story is not whether the sun matters. It does. The real story is whether Willie Soon proved it matters enough to overturn the dominant explanation. And that remains a fault line. If this breakdown made you think, leave your view in the comments. Do you believe Willie Soon exposed a real weakness in climate attribution, or do you think the scientific reaction to his work was justified? Subscribe if you want more deep documentary breakdowns focused only on Willie Soon, his research, his arguments, and the scientific response to them. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous idea is not the one that changes the answer, but the one that makes people question who gets to give it.